Are GE crops economically beneficial? The answer to this question is more complicated than it might seem, and much of the information available is, well, somewhat contradictory. Let's start with the evidence in favor of economic benefit. Most of this evidence comes from estimate-based studies. For example, a 2022 estimate by agricultural economist Graham Brooks found that the global collective income of GMO-producing farms, quote, increased by $261 billion. And this is because of crop yield increases from pest and weed reductions, and because of reductions in inputs such as pesticides and their associated costs. An earlier meta-analysis by Klumper and Kame found that GMO use was associated with an average farm profit increase of 68% globally. This might seem like indisputable evidence that GE crops are economically beneficial, but many scholars have actually criticized these types of estimates, arguing that they tend to overgeneralize the effects of particular crops and in particular regions as evidence that all GE crops everywhere are beneficial. For example, some have pointed out that the Klumper and Kame analysis disproportionately analyzed studies of IR cotton in China and India, and that it isn't necessarily a good representation of the economic effects of GE crops everywhere, even though the authors suggested this. In fact, in developing countries, the introduction of GE crops has sometimes created new economic challenges. Notably, GE crops can contribute to a process called de-skilling, in which they displace existing agricultural techniques, and gradually, farmers become unable to revert to their original practices. This is an issue when those original practices were actually more economically beneficial in the long run. For example, in India, GE herbicide-tolerant cotton displaced a practice called ox-weeding. On its own, this might not have been an issue, but when weeds ended up developing resistance to the GE-based herbicide, the GE cotton became ineffective. But by then, farmers had lost the skills and agricultural systems necessary to reinstate ox-weeding, which would have been more effective and helped them make a greater profit. So are GE crops economically beneficial? Maybe and maybe not. The evidence is mixed, and ultimately, their effects are largely context-dependent.